What's up everybody, cmdrradix here bringing you another video. And today, it's been so long since I recorded, I don't remember how to start a video. So you know that I'm getting over a cold. So those of you who have been on this channel for quite a while now know that I do these videos and a lot of my life centered around one purpose. That purpose being to pass down knowledge about the living tradition so that more people in this fractured modern world may flourish through a life rooted in and participating in that tradition, right? The purpose of this channel, ladies and gentlemen, is to sort of look back at the past, look back at the tradition and see what we can learn from it, see what we can learn and use in our modern world, or really our postmodern world. I occupy this archetype of a sort of wizard figure, a old man in a tower who has arcane wisdom, and when the young adventurer comes to this part of the kingdom, he fights his way up into my tower and is able to learn something. Can you tell that I've been really thinking about what I'm supposed to be doing with my channel lately and what purpose my channel serves? So thinking through my channel's purpose, thinking about what sort of videos I want to make, one type of video I've been thinking I've wanted to make is sort of to take a text, a traditional text, and go through the entire text in a sort of a series.
Radix, are you doing another series? You're doing series number 54 that you're not going to finish?
Yeah. So I think that's what we're going to do today. Today is going to be our first episode in a series looking through a text from the tradition, and I'm going to be giving sort of my commentary on it and what we can learn from this text. And don't worry, I picked a simple text. I was thinking of going straight into Herodotus's histories, which would be an insane amount of episodes, insane amount of videos. But I decided to start small, set my ambitions to someplace that makes sense. I'm going to be going through with you, doing a sort of group study, a book club, if you will, of Germania by Tactius. Now this is good because it is 30 chapters long, with each chapter being about a paragraph in length. So this hopefully won't take us too long, I am hoping. Now the translation I'm going to be using is the translation by Raw Egg Nationalist. Some of you might not know that he is like a scholar in Middle Ages history, and is educated in Latin, and this is his translation of the Germania, of all people. And before we start this sort of group read, this group study of this ancient text, truly an ancient text, I want to add that I'm not necessarily an expert. I am just interested in tradition, in history, in the way people have thought in the past. So this is more of a group effort. So you can definitely add in the comments below, depending on when I make another video, I might be able to comment on your comments as we go through the Germania. Just like you, I am just someone living in the postmodern world, trying to find the pre-modern world, so we can do this together as a group. So anything you want to add, please add in the comments below. I'm sure I'm going to forget something. I'm not a scholar who has dedicated my entire life to this one text. But this episode, I want to get into a little bit of the background about the Germania, or the Germania. By the way, I have some basic studies in Latin, and my Latin is in the reconstructed pronunciation, so it's not ecclesial Latin. So I'm going to be pronouncing things, you know, weedy, wiki, wichi, or whatever. Weedy, wiki, weni. I also want to add that I do have another copy of the Germania, Graphico Editions Agricola and Germania by Tactius. Do not get this. Do not get this translation. The Agricola is just copied and pasted from the Agricola translation available on Wikisource, except every time a URL link shows up, you know, whenever a name shows up that links to a Wikipedia page, it just skips it over. So if you look in my Agricola, you see a lot of pencil markings where I had to look through the Wikisource article, realize that they skipped a name or a location or an item and had to write it in pencil. Do not get the Graphico edition. This is nonsense. Now, we are interested in tradition. We're interested in the way things have been passed down. The Germania was written originally in Latin by the historian, politician, orator Tacitus, or Tacitus, in the Roman Empire in about 98 CE. However, the book does not, and it's kind of generous to call this a book. Like I've mentioned, it is basically 30 paragraphs. It's like a really long essay, more so than a book. But the book doesn't seem to have really been that popular during its time. It does not seem that there were many copies of this being made. Some copies were available in medieval monasteries, but by the time we get to the Middle Ages, basically the only manuscript found is inside a monastery in Francia, in Charlemagne's empire. So classical world didn't really pay too much close attention to the Germania, except for maybe Pliny the Younger or whoever. Pliny. What about the medievals? Did the medieval world think much of it? No, they copied like 1 or 2 manuscripts. It didn't really become part of the medieval synthesis. It really didn't become part of that medieval world. When did this become popular? It becomes popular in the Renaissance. The Renaissance, Western Europe is getting really into classical studies, getting into the history, the texts of the Latin and ancient Greek world, and so anything Latin or Greek being translated, being appreciated in the Renaissance. Tacitus himself is getting very popular because of his political philosophy, which he outlines in his annals and histories. And when we find out that there is a manuscript of a text written by Tacitus in a monastery in France about the ancient Germans, that gets translated during the Renaissance. There's a whole bidding war over it during the Renaissance, and it becomes very popular and scattered abroad through the Renaissance. Which means this book, unlike a lot of other classical texts, does not really go through the medieval synthesis like many other classical texts did during the medieval period, when the medieval Christians were trying to synthesize and relate how their ancient classical past fit into their new Christian worldview system, and sort of synthesized it out, made it all work, realized how it was put together. This didn't go through that. This pops up during the Renaissance, and by the time we're in the Renaissance, the way the Europeans are thinking is starting to diverge from the traditional medieval synthesis. So you're going to see a bunch of different theories about how what is said in the Germania fits in the wider ethnology of the Germanic people in the Middle Ages and in the classical medieval synthesis. But there's not going to be any that really sticks. That will be important because today I hope to talk a little bit about Twisto again, because I've made a video about Twisto before. There's a sort of version of old Germanic mythology that Tacitus presents that might be able to work with what we know about Germanic mythology and Germanic religion from a sort of forensic point of view, from a standard modern day anthropology point of view. But when we try to approach it from the medieval point of view, the medieval synthesis, the pre-modern conception of the world, things get a little bit funky. And you have a bunch of different theories about how it all fits together. I'm going to try to give some ideas about how it might work when we talk about Chapter 2 specifically today. But after it becomes popular in the Renaissance, this is going to go on and have a life of its own. It's an essay about the Germanic people during the first century, but it's going to grow sort of out of control. Christopher Krebs is going to call this the most dangerous book, because this book is going to be able to sort of provide some classical founding for a united German ethnicity, even though that's not entirely what Tacitus is trying to say here in this book, but it is going to be used to say, look, Romans looking at the Germanic peoples, the various Germanic tribes, recognized them under the name of Germanic. They had a recognition that there was some sort of sameness between these people. This can be used to build the origins of the German nation state, really. It's going to be in the hands of people like Machiavelli, it's going to be in the hands of people like Martin Luther, and maybe this sort of shapes his way of seeing the German people as a unique people with the unique rights, unique customs, which means it might have played a role in the Protestant Reformation to some extent, however little that might be. And then, of course, most famously, this is going to be a big deal to people like Heinrich Himmler. This is going to be a big deal to the National Socialist movement in 20th century Germany, going to be important to people like Adolf Hitler. This is, again, going to be an example of the German people as a race, as a unified race, a unified nation, against the concept of other nations like Bavaria and the Rhineland and Swabia and all that. This is going to help solidify the National Socialist agenda of a united German folk. But that's sort of going beyond our purposes for this video. Our purpose is to look at this video, or no, look at this essay at its own terms. Tacitus wrote this, Tacitus is known as a philosophical historian. Edward Gibbon called him that. A philosophical historian. Like a lot of historians of the ancient world, writing a history isn't about finding things the way it happened and then just representing what happened. It is a type of philosophy. History has a meaning to it, and there are messages in history. Tacitus has a message when he's talking about the German people, their ethnology, their history. He's trying to say something. What is he trying to say? He's trying to say that the Roman Empire and the culture of the Roman Empire, or the folkways of the Roman Empire, we can talk about how culture is a sort of modern word later on, but how the Roman way of life has become decadent, has become hypocritical, has become complicated, corrupted, partly through the fruits of civilization. Tacitus looks at the Germanic people, the barbarians, the people who have not entered Romanity, as it were, or at least from Tacitus's perspective, had not yet entered Romanity, looking at them as a sort of more a more baseline human existence, something that's more in line with how humans should live. In a lot of ways, I just finished reading I'll Take My Stand by 12 Southerners, which was an agrarian manifesto against the Industrial Revolution. In a lot of ways, Tacitus is doing a sort of pre-industrial version of that. How civilization itself is a bit of a corrupting factor on human nature, and going beyond the bounds of civilization, then humans are able to live more in tandem with their human nature. A lot of histories of Germany, for example, will start with the Germania and say,
well, Tacitus wrote this, but he really isn't trying to do a history. He's trying to make a parallel philosophy between Romans and Germans, blah, blah, blah. And
they're talking about that as if that's a bad thing. For us who want to rediscover the pre-modern way of looking at the world, that's not a bad thing. That's a good thing. That's what history is for. On the contrary, history that just tells things as it is doesn't really tell you anything. They have literally taken meaning out of the history. Tacitus's way of doing history, the ancient way of doing history, the classical medieval way of doing history, is much more meaningful on a literal sense because they actually care about meaning. So as we read through the Germania, I want us to think about the degeneracy of the industrialized world and sort of seeing this parallel between how Tacitus views Rome and how we view the post-industrial world versus how Tacitus views Germania, the Germans, and how we might view the Romans, how we might view the pre-modern world. at the very least, a way of life, maybe you could say an agrarian way of life, that's more aligned with human values in a way that the industrial world really isn't. But without further ado, let's begin our study of Germania by Tactius. The full name of the text is On the Origin, Situation, Customs, and Peoples of Germany, De Origine Situ Moribus ac Populis Germanorum. I don't know why I ended that word like that. Chapter 1. Germany as a whole is separated from the Gauls and from the Rheti and Pannoni by the rivers Rhine and Danube respectively, from the Sarmatians and the Dacians by mutual fear or mountains. So Tactius starts off, two things to really talk about in this very first sentence. One, he is very clearly doing a parallel with the way Julius Caesar, started his commentary on the Gallic Wars. I actually have his commentary on my bookshelf. Give me a second. Let's compare these two sentences between Tacitus and Julius Caesar. Germania. Germany as a whole is separated from the Gauls and from the Rheti and Pannoni by the rivers Rhine and Danube respectively, from the Sarmatians and Dacians by mutual fear or mountains. Versus Julius Caesar. Gaul, taken as a whole, is divided into three parts, one of which is inhabited by the Belgae, another by the Aquitani, and the third by a people who call themselves Celts and whom we call Gauls. We have that first few beginning. Gaul, taken as a whole, is divided. Germany as a whole is separated, right? Tacitus very much respects Julius Caesar's way of doing history. There is a callback to Julius Caesar's commentary, which was very popular even in Tacitus's day. The second thing I want to mention is the strong interconnection between what we today would call history, ethnography, and geography. In Herodotus's histories, which it starts off the historical Western tradition, which Tacitus is a part of, was originally a travel log. It was him describing lands he had either been to or had talked to people who had been to get a catalog of the entire world, right? He's not just trying to tell the story of the past, he's trying to understand how does this all look laid out on a map, and who are these people who live in these different places, right? Today we separate them up into three different, distinct pieces. The ancients would bring it all together into one discipline. Although disciplines themselves are also... There's no real concept of the interdisciplinary in the ancient world, because there is already an interconnected view of how the world works in the pre-modern world. But Tacitus is going to start off our history and ethnography of the Germans through geography. Keep that in mind as we go through the rest of Chapter 1. The rest the ocean encircles, embracing broad peninsulas and immense extents of islands. Certain peoples and kings have recently been made known to us by war. The Rhine arises on a remote and precipitous height of the Rhaetian Alps, turns with a moderate bend to the west, and mixes with the ocean in the north. The Danube flows gently from a mild ridge of the Abnaba range, passes many peoples, until in Pontus it meets the sea with 6 mouths, the 7th being consumed by marshes. So in Chapter 1, he has painted a picture of this land, the bounds of this land that we're going to be looking at as we go through the text. Moving on to Chapter 2, and I have a lot to say about Chapter 2. I should believe the Germans are indigenous and have barely mixed with other peoples through migrations and friendships, because in the past, seekers of new homelands traveled not by land but by boat, and the immense and, I should say, hostile ocean beyond is rarely crossed by ships from our world. So, we're trying to figure out where the Germans came from. Tacitus is saying they're probably from Germany. Well, what does he mean by that? Well, he says typically when people move, they are moving to find better land, okay? Usually by ship, he mentions by boat. Keep in mind, he himself is a Roman. He is participating in the idea that the Romans were Trojans, and they were, who, when Aeneas left the fall of Troy through a long chain of events, ended up landing in Italy, right? And the Trojans would become the ancestors to the Romans in Italy. They sailed from Troy to go off to Italy, right? So he's pulling from that tradition. What does he know? He knows his people came to Rome through traveling looking for better lands. So there seems to be a trend of people looking for better lands. But the Germans, as he goes on, who indeed, to add to the horrors of the unknown sea, would leave Asia or Africa or Italy and make for Germany, appalling in its soils, harsh in its climate, dismal in its culture and appearance, unless it were their fatherland. There is a lot to talk about here. Who in their right minds would leave Asia or Africa for Germany? So we can pull some things out of this already. He is referencing to the hostile climate of Germany, which will be a common theme of Germany's climate not being hospitable for the creation of civilization, that it's a rough land, it's a cold land, it's an unforgiving land, and it's going to create a rough, tough people, okay? Also note that he talks about the Germans not being mixed. There are two things that are going to sort of come out of this. One is the Germans as pure. This idea of the Germans being pure, having an attribute of purity to them, because they're not from a mix of different people from all around the world. These are these guys who just spawned out of the ground, and as we'll see in the next paragraph, mythologically speaking, spawned out of the ground, and have stayed here and have stayed in their same way, you know, from Tacitus's point of view, no civilization. They haven't really developed here. They are staying in a very, not just indigenous in the sense that they are of the land, but indigenous in the sense that they are not corrupted by the complexities of civilization. This is how they are pure, right? So there's this connection between the concept of the German and the concept of purity. Then there is going to be this sense of barbarity, partly because they're pure, but also because of the climate. The harsh climate is going to lead to them being stronger. He's comparing this, keep in mind, to the Roman Empire, to an Italy that has seen a large amounts of migration, a large amounts of people moving from different parts of the empire to other parts of the empire, especially cosmopolitan Rome, the city itself. It's losing its Latin identity and starting to see the rise of a Romanity, a Roman identity that's based on Roman Latin civilization, but it's no longer being tied to the specifically Latin ethnic group anymore. It's starting to throw in things like Celts from Gaul, things like Syriacs from Syria, Egyptians, Greeks, that are all sort of assimilating to this one culture and becoming this Romanity. But also sort of edging out the heritage Latins, shall we say. Likewise, there's also the fact Tacitus is very aware of this, of the warmness of Southern Europe, right? And he's making this attribution between the coldness of the north versus the temperate climate more of the south, and how that has produced two different worldviews. Again, keep in mind, Tacitus wants to say that the Romans have become degenerate, they have become decadent, while the Germans have maintained some sort of purity in some way, shape, or form. Well, why do we have this difference in the first place? Tacitus theorizes maybe it has to do with the climate, maybe it has to do with the fact that the Germans showed up in Germany and nobody else came in. But even then, Tacitus recognizes he's still a Roman. Don't think about this as sort of, an American who looks at what they perceive as more traditional conservative values in Russia, and then they start standing Russia and talking about how Russia is so great. They want Russia to win whatever geopolitical contest there is at the expense of their own country, right? He's not doing that. Tacitus is recognizing he's going to be, appraising a lot of what the Germans do in comparison to the Romans, but he is still a Roman. He still has hope in the Romans. He wouldn't be writing this essay in the first place if he didn't think that the Romans could learn and improve. He wasn't a black pillar for Romanity, for Romanness, for the Roman Empire. And he wasn't going to start going over to the German side and talking about how, you know what, I want the Germans to crush the Roman Empire, right? He's not going to do that. He still recognizes Germany as a brutal place, as a dismal place. His second paragraph is talking about who would go in this appalling, harsh, dismal culture, and this dismal, he says, dismal in its culture and appearance. Who could love Germany unless it was their fatherland, right? Let's move on. They sing mythical poems, their only history and chronicles of the earth-born god Twisto and his son Manus, the fathers and founders of the nation. To Manus they attribute 3 sons, from whose names come those of the Ingaiones on the coast, of the Erminones in the middle of the country, and of the Istaiones, the rest. Some say, with the license of antiquity, that the god had more sons who produced more tribes, Marsi, Gambriui, Suebi, and Wandili, being true and ancient names. Others say that the very name Germans is a recent adoption, because those who first crossed the Rhine and expelled the Gauls are now the Tungri, but were Germans then. Only gradually did the name become a national and not a tribal name. At first, through fear, the vanquished Gauls called other tribes Germans, who soon adopted the name themselves once they had discovered the fear it brought. There is a lot to unpack there. First, we see them singing songs, that their history is told through poem, through song. Very much, before Herodotus, the main theory of history was that presented by Homer, that being sung verse, being mostly mythological in nature, or what we might call mythological in nature, right? And the Germans are still in that stage of development, according to Tacitus. It should be mentioned that Tacitus himself probably didn't go to Germany. He seems to be basing his account off of other people's accounts of Germany and the Germans. But that the only way that matters is if you have like a modernist empirical view of history. I want to skip down first towards the name Germans. The fact that the Germans themselves hear other people call them Germans and decide to adopt the name Germans themselves suggests a lack of an internalized identification between the German people. This is a mark against the people who try to think about Tacitus's Germania as evidence of supporting a united German ethnic group. Really what this is showing is that there wasn't a large sense of internal consistency and continuity between the Germanic peoples. They understood that, yeah, we're Germanic, we're the Germans, and there are these other groups that call us Germans, fine, but they had to adopt this term that was created from the outside, right? The internal continuity wasn't there with the early German people. They were very much lacking in a group definition that we would call Germans today. Now, I want to spend the rest of this video talking about Twisto, the earthborn god Twisto and his son Manus, the fathers and founders of the nations who have sons. The amount of sons Manus has doesn't really matter. The point is, we're establishing a divine origin for the German people. The German people have an ancestry that goes up through to the gods. And yes, it's going to divide on the smaller level into the German nations, what we might call the German tribes, right? But overall, however many sons Manus had, that's not really the point. The point is we have this connection. Now, Manus' name obviously sounds like the word man. We're showing that the earthborn god Twisto is born, the divine exists, and the son of the divine is man, Manus, right? In this way, you could say that Manus is participating in the pattern of Adam, but he's also participating in the pattern of all mankind. You have the gods, the creation, right? You have man, and then coming out of the tribe of man, or the tribe of the Germans, right? Now, I have made a video about Twisto before. I do not remember what I said in that video, and I did not look back to see what I said in that video. But I think I gave a sort of theory maybe about what Twisto is. Whatever I said in that video, crumple it up, throw it in the trash. I'm going to put in a new theory about Twisto. Looking into it, I do seem convinced that there is probably some sort of connection between Twisto and Ymir. Ymir is the Jotun, the frost giant, the ancestor of all frost giants, and also the gigantic force that is ripped apart to create the world, right? This is a common trope we see in a lot of Indo-European mythology, generally speaking. We see it in India, for example. This deep primordial being, sometimes an antagonistic primordial being who is ripped apart. He's the ancestor of the giants. Ymir is participating in the pattern of the giants, the sort of demonic race that inhabited the world before the flood. And note, you have the flood in Christian mythology, this that ends the giants for the most part. Likewise with Ymir, you have this giant, right, this evil giant thing, and what happens to it gets ripped apart. Blood everywhere, right? It's a type of flood. I should mention this, since if this is someone's first video on this channel, this is going to come out of nowhere. I am an Orthodox Christian. I'm going to be interpreting everything through an Orthodox Christian lens. You could interpret it whatever tradition you're from. That's your thing, man. Let me do my thing. Just as Twisto is born of the earth, as Tactius puts it, Ymir is sort of the foundations of the world that's ripped apart. The world is ripped apart and reconstructed anew, right? And so you see this sort of threefold path of, you have the primordial times, the before times, the times of the giants, right? That was destroyed in the flood, and then you have man dominates the world instead of the giants, and then it's divided into nations. If you wanted to be more literal with Twisto, if you wanted Twisto to be a metaphysically intact person, and he might have been, then Twisto could easily have been a descendant of Japheth, right? Japheth, the son of Noah, who in Christian mythology is sort of the ancestor towards the European peoples. There definitely seems to be a connection between Japheth and the inhabitants of Europe into the Bronze Age and later. There's a reason why the first sort of scientific approach towards the Indo-Europeans was to look at them as the sons of Japheth. So Twisto could be a descendant of Japheth, Manus a descendant of Twisto, and then their descendants, whoever is the ancestor to the Germans, whatever. And this is where we're going to bring in the Renaissance thinkers. Some of the Renaissance thinkers also connected him to Japheth. There was an effort to try to connect Twisto to Ashkenaz, the son of Gomer, who was a descendant of Japheth. I'm not going to put money on my bets on what exactly Twisto is, but what I am going to say is Twisto is showing that pattern that we see over and over of the divine origins of humanity, of the divine, and how that trickles down, this creation of the world, this, theodrama of the world, trickling down into eventually our story as the Swebi, for example. There's this connection there that we see across basically all cultures on the planet in history. But we're actually over time. I was hoping this would be at least 30 minutes long. I don't know how much this is going to look like in post after I edit it, but there we have it, the first 2 chapters of the Germania. I hope you enjoyed. Subscribe to this channel if you have not yet, especially if you're interested in learning from tradition. If you want to reject modernity and embrace tradition. He said the words. But thank you guys so much for watching. Follow me on social media. All the links are in the description, and have a great day, ladies and gentlemen.